Happy Monday. How's it going, everybody?
It's going well. Welcome, Andrew. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. Looking
Hey,
Yeah.
forward to it.
happy
Um,
Monday evening for you, I guess.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
yeah, cover what you wish for. Awesome. How's everybody's weekend?
Was good. Yeah, it was a nice low key weekend. I got back from San Francisco Friday morning and just kind of recovered from a great week. So,
Oh yeah, yeah. I know what you mean. It just felt like I'm pretty sure I felt like every conference attendee that either went to Snowflake Summit and or Databricks. It just after a bit you feel like a bomb's been dropped on you mentally. So yeah, and anyway, then last night I had the fire alarm going off all night for some stupid reason, so I had to decommission that. So I'm pretty exhausted. But and Andrew, it sounds like you had some fun with alarms as well. So
Yeah, we've got the alarm downstairs we enable at night, and getting up with baby in the night and forgetting to switch it off wakes up the rest of the house. So
oh Jesus,
yeah, we're tired too. I'm tired too, but
yay for the alarm club. Awesome.
yeah, yeah, very secure, babe.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. Cool. For people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'm Andrew Jones. I'm a principal engineer at GoCarless, who are a fintech based in London. And my background, first half of my career is more software engineering, and then in the second half, more data engineering, data platforms. So I've been at GoCarless now for nearly 6 years, joined as kind of a first sort of data engineering, data platform hire, and built out data platform from there over the last 6 years with a team.
Cool.
and we understand that you're working on a book right now. In fact, I've seen parts of it. So,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I've been working on book and data contracts. Data contracts, obviously, a topic we're going to talk about a lot today. It's something that we came up with at GoCarders a couple of years ago, and obviously since now it's quite a big industry topic. Got the opportunity to write a book about it. That's been very enjoyable, very hard work, as you both know, I'm sure. And that's coming out next week. So yeah,
Oh,
very
that's
excited about
cool.
that.
Perfect. Where can people find this new book? What's the book called?
It's called Driving Data Quality of Data Contracts. You can pre-order it now on Amazon, amazon.com.co.uk, and it'll be on all the other channels once it's released.
Nice. We'll drop a link in the show notes when we're good to go. Yeah, congrats on the book. I remember seeing rumblings of this. We chatted a bit about it. I think Matt was maybe a bit more involved than I was, but yeah, congrats on the finish line there. And but it's interesting too. There's this notion of data contracts, right? If I think by accounts you came up with the term, and so now you got a book. So I think it kind of speaks to the maturity of this idea, but maybe rewind. Let's walk through the inception of a data contract, and let's also define it. Maybe we'll start defining it. What Andrew? What's a data contract?
Yeah, I think the main thing is an interface for the data. And that sounds simple, and it is in many ways, but the word interface is quite important. It's quite key, I think. Because when you start thinking about interfaces, you start defining expectations around how to access data, how reliable it is, how accurate it is, who owns it, documentation, all those kind of things. Much like any other interface, much like an API, or much like a library you use, like a Panda library or something, they've all got interfaces. And I think that interface idea, that's kind of a key part of the data contract, is kind of the interface idea. I think you kind of need every time you're building some kind of on top of some kind of dependency, whether it's a library, an API, data, whatever it is, an interface is what gives you the confidence to build on that. And then with data contracts, you can go beyond the interface and into other things like governance and things like that. But I think interface is the core thing for data contracts.
and what drove you initially to come up with this idea? You come from a software engineering background. Not all of us in data necessarily do. We've been working software engineers outside of the data realm. Did that have something to do with it, or was there really a different driver?
Yeah, I think it did. I think the way it came around was, so like I mentioned, I go Carlos lucky enough to join when there wasn't really a data platform and build it out from scratch. And we kind of built out what we thought was like a reference data infrastructure. We implemented a change data capture service, CDC service, dragged all that data into BigQuery, so on Google Cloud, and then just let our BI and data engineers and data scientists have at it, invest your data and go and build things on it. And then I'll be in meetings with the data scientists and BI people regularly, weekly, and always hearing about the issues they're having with data. maybe an incident caused by a schema change, maybe not be able to find the data they need, maybe the amount of work they have to do to make the data usable. All the kind of things that I think many of us hear a lot, I think, as data consumers. And we eventually just start thinking, like, there must be a better way to be doing this. Like, this can't be it, really, in 2020s. Like, if we believe data is valuable, and if we as a company want to use our data to drive maybe ML-based products or drive decisions or get value from that data, then we need it to be of decent quality. Otherwise, there's no point, really. You can't really get value from data. So how do you improve quality of data? I think you can only do that for source. I think my software engineering background helped, because if I was a software engineer and I wanted to get data from someone else's database, I would never go direct to a database and say, can I have access to the database? I'll just query it, hope for best. It's better to be reliable for any period of time. I'd be like, no, let's create an API. And we have a discussion about that. I'll set one up. That's quite easy to do. Creating APIs is easy, any modern language with any libraries. And create an interface away from an interface between that database of theirs and myself. And then I'll go away, use that, and I can rely on that. But why, I just kind of thought, like, why in data do you think it's okay to depend on the internal model of the database via CDC or via some ELT process and expect that to be reliable? It never will be. It cannot be. So I think that's kind of where my software engineering background came in. And I think, like, that's why that's kind of where the word data contract came from, looking at kind of an API. An API is like a contract between a consumer and provider. You've got the interface. The word contract kind of stuck, and then we kind of call it data contracts. So that's kind of where it came from initially.
Interesting. We're already getting some questions here. If you don't mind, we'll drop one. Scott Taylor. Good morning, Scott. Data Whisperer. He asks, do you think the word contract could be confusing to business people who are not familiar with the specific context for your definition? To most business people, a contract is a legal agreement. Andrew, thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And yes, it can be, I think. Certainly when I first started using that name internally at GoCarlos, it was never, that's kind of the comments we got, the questions we got, like, you sure you don't want me using contract? It kind of, do I have to sign it in blood? Things like that. And that is a bit of an unfortunate thing with the name. I did always intend to come up with a better name, but I never got around to it.
Okay, so we get the name we deserve then. So
yeah, but certainly you don't. It shouldn't be this strict. It shouldn't be a legal agreement. It's a lot of data contracts, particularly when I talk about data contracts, I'm talking about collaboration between consumers and generators. I don't want there to be a barrier between them. I want to not bring those people a lot closer together. And sometimes that word contract might get in the way. On the flip side, it sets a certain level of expectation about what to expect from the data contract. Like, it's something you can kind of depend upon. It's something that's kind of going to be stable. It's something that you've agreed and it's going to be relatively stable for a long period of time, relatively long period of time. So I think it does kind of help with that kind of expectation, where certainly when I think about data contracts and how we're doing it at GoCarlos, is we're trying to move away from data that is, like, think about just getting the data, sucking it all in, chucking it in somewhere else, but being more explicit about data, about producing data products that meet a need and that are more stable and that are longer lived than internal database model.
Yeah, I think especially when data contracts came on the scene, I think there was a lot of discussion about the word contract, and I think maybe I think it's a fair thing, right? Because you're introducing a term that normally isn't associated with software data. I think the word interface is good. And you mentioned data products. I always kind of looked at it as sort of the equivalent of like a bill of materials or something like that. Like, here's the expectation of what the ingredients, i.e. schema, are of what you're expecting and so forth. But yeah, I think it but in a lot of ways too, I think it caused the debate, sort of popularized the notion of data contracts. I think if you'd called it something like data interface or something, it wouldn't have had maybe quite the attention that. So for anyone who wants to come up with a new idea, definitely label it something that's maybe slightly. If you were to fast forward to today, if you were to do it over, would you still call it data contracts? Would you have a different term for it?
Yeah, good question. I think I probably would. Like today, I would. I think, But I think I wouldn't be surprised if in 5-10 years' time we don't really call it data contracts anymore. And that, like, because I mentioned like the API analogy before, but like when you're getting data via an API to get data from data contract, it's much the same. It's an interface you're going through. The difference with data and data contracts is that interface tends to be more asynchronous or batch orientated, as opposed to a call you're making to a service and getting data back. And then these volumes of data tend to be larger as well. But I think as data engineering moves more towards software engineering, because I believe that's happening, then I don't think software engineers will necessarily call this data contracts. I just call this asynchronous APIs, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, when I talk to my software friends, I mean, they're like, "Oh, we've been doing this for ages. Like, I don't know what the big deal is." Like, it's yeah, it's almost amusing because they sort of look at it like, yeah, that's old hat. So, but yeah, I mean, I do agree with your notion that data engineering and software engineering are, in a lot of regards, fusing together. So, yeah. Omar, he has a good question here. Good morning, Omar, or afternoon. I guess he's in Switzerland. What are the different ways data contracts are being implemented? Can you share a few examples?
Yeah, so there's a few examples come to light over the last couple of years. There's a good one from just looking at the contract definition itself. PayPal, fairly recently open source their data contract kind of specification. It's like a YAML definition. And that's quite nice. It's quite interesting to see how they've done it. It's quite complete, I'll say. There's a lot in there. But they're basically using a YAML definition, and then I don't think they've spoken too much about what happens beyond that, but that's kind of the interface. That's kind of what contract looks like. I've written about how we do it at GoCarless. We use defining something called JSONet, which is like JSON, but with function extensions and things like that. And the reason we use JSONet is because we build data contracts or implement data contracts on top of our infrastructure platform. So we have an infrastructure as code platform, in-house developed, and that uses JSONet throughout, and we built data contracts on top of that. And that's why we use JSONet. It's not necessarily a good choice for it over better in YAML. It's just, I think when it comes to implementing data contracts, it's best to try and implement it where your engineers already are. And for us, that was in JSONet and with the infrastructure platform. For other people, it might be somewhere else. Another implementation I've seen or I've worked on recently is an example, actually from a book that you mentioned, but an example in that I've built one on top of something called Plumi, which is another infrastructure as code platform using YAML definition. I think because I quite like it implemented in the infrastructure, like in the infrastructure layer, because I think that allows you to do quite a lot more with taking a contract, building the interfaces and providing them, which could be a Kafka topic with a schema, could be a BigQuery table, Snowflake table, whatever it might be. So I quite like the ones that are implemented in the infrastructure layer. So yeah, there's a few implementations I've seen or I've worked on myself.
And so tell me more about the details of how this happens. So are you still doing change data capture, and where does the actual contract checking happen? Does it happen in that, like, does it happen inside of Kafka or somehow on the during CDC before data gets put into BigQuery, for example? And then what happens if the data is not compliant, for example, with the contract expectations?
Yeah, so like, as I mentioned, we try and do it at infrastructure level, and that allows us, well, first of all, like we still do use CDC at the moment at GoCarless, but we're trying to move away from that. So we're not trying to build data contracts on top of CDC. We're trying to move to a different route of populating the data where it's more explicit. So the service is sending data to the data platform in some way.
Oh, interesting. So in other words, so let me follow that thread a bit, if that's okay. So in other words, right now it sounds like your application writes to the database, and then you have CDC, and so then the data passes through CDC into BigQuery, and the alternative is what? That the application writes to the database, but then also writes into another target that is where the data will flow into BigQuery eventually?
Yeah, basically, yeah. We're using PubSub, so often it'll go through PubSub into BigQuery. It might go direct to BigQuery. Sometimes they might be able to write directly to that location, to BigQuery or PubSub or whoever else they're writing data to. More often, because they want to keep their internal database, the upstream database, in sync with BigQuery ultimately, you have to think about transactional guarantees, which is a bit of a big topic, but basically what you want to do is to ensure they are completely in sync, you need to make sure you're writing to almost like one unit of work within a transaction. So what you do is use something like the outbox pattern. And what you do is you write to your database, you write within the same database transaction, you write to another table called the outbox table, and later you bring that into BigQuery somehow. So it becomes eventually consistent in BigQuery. And then like if there's any problem writing to one of those places, it will roll back and your database, both places will stay in sync in will be consistent. So that's only required if you need that strong consistency between your upstream database and the downstream, like BigQuery in our case. If you don't, you can save a lot of complexity by just writing in 2 steps. And if you're fine with data not being 100% accurate, which in many cases you probably are, that's fine. Where you do need it to be 100% accurate, you want to use something like the outbox pattern or listen to yourself pattern or those other little patterns you got from software engineering.
Yeah, this actually kind of relates to a question here. Can we get live streaming data option in data contract? So I think you've using PubSub. I think you kind of answered this question. I know that Chad Sanderson too, when he was been writing about this, I think he was using Kafka. So again, it's
yeah, exactly. PubSub and Kafka are quite good because both of them support schemas at the topic level. So you can use that schema enforcement to do a basic check of data quality, I guess. So like, does the data match schema? It's not giving you loads of checks. It's only giving you types and things like that. Although Kafka can do a bit more because Kafka, you can use the schema registry, JSON schema, and JSON schema, you've got other checks you can put in around like min-max values and enums and things like that. But by having these kind of checks at the infrastructure level, it means that you can't publish to Kafka or PubSub unless that data matches schema. You've got a certain level of defensibility there. Mm-hmm. And if it fails, the alert will go to the service owner and they'll get the alert and they'll deal with it. And the impact is reduced on everyone downstream. You know, you might have many downstream consumers. If they all get bad data, they might all have to take some kind of steps to recover from that. If you're just preventing that at the source, as close to the source as possible, it's a lot cheaper to recover from that incident. You only have to fix it in one place, you publish it to all consumers, and they just go and continue their work.
Yeah. But I feel like, and this has been my problem with data contracts, is that I feel like it treats the symptom, but it doesn't treat the cause of why an issue took place. And so even if you are able to capture, no pun intended, the, an error, right, in what you're expecting, I mean, you still haven't addressed why that error happened. Can you maybe walk us through some of the maybe root cause resolutions that you found to be useful?
Yeah, so if you think about why that happened, at Good Colors and like many organizations, we have quite a good incident culture. So what happens if like an exception gets thrown by a service, we'll create an incident about that, and the team managing the service will be assigned to lead that incident, and they'll go and look into why that was caused. And with data, that could be many reasons. Obviously, it could be data entry at the source system somewhere was not validated, and it's going to try to write that down to the source system. It could be a bug in the code. It could be many reasons, really. But all of those reasons are in the source system. It's all code, or some lack of validation or something there. And that's the only place you can really fix that properly is at the source system, so it doesn't happen again. So you then go and change your code and you add more validation or whatever it might be, fix a bug, redeploy that service, and repopulate the data. I think that's the only place you can fix the data, really. You can't do this sort of stuff downstream. You can't, if data hasn't been produced upstream, you can't go and produce it again downstream, really. You can't go and improve quality of, more broadly, you can't improve quality of data downstream. You can only really improve it at the source. Mm-hmm. If it's missing downstream, you can't infer it. You can't add values that are missing. You can infer things, but you're not really improving the quality of data. You have to do that at the source where the data was actually generated.
Let me follow on with a question about change management. And this goes back to maybe conflicting definitions of what a data contract is and how people understand it. But I think one of the common critiques I hear is that if you put data contracts in place, it now becomes very hard to make changes to source data. So you want to add fields or columns or change the structure of the data somehow. Now, to be honest, I assume this is also, a problem in software development. What's your response to that? Like, how do you deal with change management if you're using data contracts? How do you make sure that you can maintain like speed and agility of innovation in your source data?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's a couple of ways to answer it. I think one way is that like you've got to think about what you want from your data. Do you want it to be agile and changing regularly, or do you want it to be more stable so you can build on it with confidence and build some ML-based product that is you're going to sell to customers and make money from it? Would you rather favor stability there or agility of data changing? And same in software. Would you rather your software change regularly and the API change regularly, or would you rather have stability? And you think about like, people build on top of like Slack API. What do they want? They want stability. They're building businesses on top of Slack API. They want stability there. Same should be true internally. If you're building products on top of the data or applications on top of data, you want those to be stable. You don't want them changing every day. So I think that kind of friction, for at least for breaking changes, is kind of intentional with data contracts. We're saying we favor stability more than that agility. Otherwise, I don't know how you can really build on top of that with any confidence.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the core of the book that I'm writing too, is I feel like the data problems need to be treated as upstream as possible, but we also have to have along the data lifecycle a coherent view of what the model is, the core model, right, and all the submodels that I mean, as a Jason Taylor, aka LinkedIn user, says, iteration will depend on where in the lifecycle the data/data product is, and it's absolutely correct. So I think all too often what we do is we focus on the siloed aspects of what we're trying to achieve. So software has one aim, right, and that's the flexibility part you're talking about. I can add whatever fields I want to the to my database and my API, and that's how that goes. But that obviously does have consequences. And I think this speaks to your point too. I think I see the relationship between data engineering and software engineering becoming a lot tighter as a result of this. Because if you only have data contracts in place but you don't have the relationship part, I find it really hard to believe that this is going to scale, right? Because data teams are inherently playing defense, and
Exactly.
and there's the old saying, "Crap flows downhill," and that's the reality of it. And so, well, that's reality we need to get away from too. So.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think a lot of their contracts, at least for me, and what I'm trying to do at GoCarless, is to try and bring those groups together, of people together, a lot closer. So the software engineers, data engineers, the actual data users, the BI users. And that goes two ways. It's not just saying software engineers produce better quality data. It's like, as data consumers, saying, look, we as a business, we want to use this data to produce some business value. It's important to a business for these reasons. For that, to do that effectively and to do that, so build something we can maintain, we need a bit better data at source too. Let's work together on that, a bit more partnership. You produce a bit of data for us in a good quality, and I'm committed to keeping that data relatively stable so I can build on it. We'll go and do things with data, some modeling or whatever we do with that, produce some value for a business, and together we deliver business value. So yeah, it's got to be a conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess the next question would be, to what extent can, let me actually put a comment up here. To what extent can API or like say contract versioning allow you to have both at the same time? I mean, I assume there are some limits, but maybe this partially solves the problem.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And that's true. So when we talk about changes data, there's kind of two class changes. There's breaking changes and there's non-breaking changes. So a non-breaking change would be adding a new field to a data contract or to a schema. And for those, they can be low friction. They don't impact any downstream consumer. They just ignore that field. Anyone who does need that field can then use the latest version and can start using that field. But for anyone else using it currently, no impact. So no friction needed to be introduced there. What we're talking about with breaking changes is where you want to create a new version and have some sort of migration path to that new version. Because you don't want to just roll that change out and break everything downstream, particularly about things downstream are important.
Well, that's kind of the default, actually. So
at the moment, yeah. Exactly, yeah, and that's what we're trying to move away from. That introduce a bit more stability there. I mean, for breaking change, you can have, you can have some sort of migration plan for that. You can maybe run. Depends how big a change it is and how important the data is and how many consumers you've got. Again, it's about communication between the people producing the data, people consuming the data to decide how do you make a breaking change to that data contract. And maybe some migration, maybe you run both side by side for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, depending on how big a change it is, how many people are affected. Whatever you need to do, really. The way we're doing it at Go Carlos and the way I like, maybe I'm optimistic, I don't know. But I think if you just get people talking, they will work out what best to do. Give them the right tools, give them the empower them to communicate and collaborate together.
Yeah.
And majority of the time, the right outcomes will happen.
Sure. And LinkedIn user, aka Jason Taylor, he asks, how do you define what a breaking change is?
Yeah, good question. So breaking change is something that impacts a existing user. So if you remove a required field, that's going to impact someone using that field. That's a breaking change. If you're using something like Kafka, PubSub, under the hood they use things like Avro and Protobuf and JSON schema. All of those have very clear schema compatibility rules, and they're basically the same for all of them. But they're very clear exactly what a breaking and non-breaking change is for that particular schema definition language.
Mm. Good point. Let me rewind a bit to another question here from Hassan, who asks, what are the core metadata components that a data contract should capture?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I think metadata components is, I spoke about data contracts being an interface, and that's kind of what the core is. But when we started thinking about that, we thought, well, if we take it a little step further and start putting some metadata components in the data contract as well, we could do a whole host of things via tooling. We can automate a lot of data governance. We can, like I mentioned, we can provision these kind of interfaces with BigQuery, table, PubSub topic, Kafka topic, whatever it is. You can just start doing quite a lot just by collecting a bit of metadata around the data. Exactly what that should be depends on your organization, what you want to do with data contracts, what your governance requirements are, what your regulatory requirements are. Obviously, being in fintech, in finance, we are quite highly regulated. We handle a lot of personal data, a lot of bank data, a lot of sensitive data. So we have things in our data contract around, like, is it secret confidential? Is it personal data or not personal data? Things like that. And we use that to then build tooling that does the right thing around sort of GDPR deletions or removing data when we should no longer keep it and things like that, or do access controls as well. All those things we managed to automate and the automation is quite easy, really. Once you have that metadata, it's quite easy to build tooling that takes that and does the right thing with data, really making it a lot easier to manage this data and produce this data.
Interesting. Got another question here from a LinkedIn user. That's all the good questions. Are there certain org structures that benefit more or less from contracts versus others? Centralized versus decentralized, in parentheses, throw in data mesh or fabric for giggles?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, it's a question I'm thinking about a lot when it comes to our structure as well, and how I would like to potentially influence how that might change in future. I would say probably certainly decentralized is probably the way. It's probably benefit more. I think. I think most organizations become more decentralized as they grow in a way. You kind of have to be. And that's when with data mesh and stuff, you kind of move into more decentralized model with things like infrastructure as code and platform engineering. You move into decentralized models. You kind of end up doing that anyway. And data contracts is another tool to help you move to a decentralized architecture where you're moving ownership data into a business, into domains, if you like, data mesh language into domains. Have that owning it, have them providing data products to other parts of a business. So I think, yeah, larger, more decentralized organizations probably benefit more from data contracts.
Interesting.
How does this? Is there a place for data contracts in a world with data sharing? So, for example, if a government is going to share data externally, would data contracts be useful in that context?
Yeah, I was thinking that actually. I was listening to your episode last week with another Andrew, and yeah, I think for it, I think a bit like with APIs, you could create standards around data contracts, like in same way you got standards around REST APIs, but whether people respect them or not when building their own ones is up for debate. And we don't see that much of REST APIs. They're all REST, but they're all slightly different. But certainly when it comes to providing data to other parties, to third parties, I see no reason why that shouldn't be a data contract for all the same reasons that you use data contracts internally. You're providing something you want that's well documented, that's stable for them to build on, that's reliable for them. So I think it should be, if you're sending data to another party, then I think, data contracts would be useful for that. When it comes to something about government sharing and kind of open data and things like that, whether there's some sort of standard we can adopt, your discussion last week was really good about that. And data contracts could form a potential feature there, but it's not something that I've seen much of so far.
Well, I think you could extend that to any third-party data, really. APIs, I mean, these are notorious. I mean, the good APIs will at least hopefully tell you things that are upcoming, and so you can get ready for it. But I mean, all too often, I know we've probably all individually seen and experienced the fun of a breaking change in a third-party API and consequences of that mess. So, I don't know, and it's interesting because I on some level, I think a contract would be helpful. On the other hand, like how is it enforceable, right? To kind of go back to contract nomenclature, a contract is great. It also has to have some level of enforceability. And so, or as some people have pointed out too, which I kind of want your take on, SLA, right? So service level agreement, like what are we expecting at the end of the day contractually and so forth. So.
Yeah, I had a conversation with someone about this a few months ago, actually, because they had business where they depend, like partner of some big, I don't name them, but some big software house, and they build plugins and extensions for that part that work on that platform. A bit like the Slack example I gave earlier, people build businesses on top of that, and they're like, well, how do I get them to produce better quality data for me? Can I data contract help? And I think, again, similar to an API, like you can start to talk about SLAs that encompass for data as well. Start putting that in your actual agreements with them. And how easy that is to do depends on like how your partnership with that third party. If you're trying to ask Salesforce to implement data contracts just for you, it's probably, and you're a small company, it's probably not likely to happen. But if you've got a different kind of partnership where you've got a bit more influence, there's no reason why the quality of data could not be part of that agreement you have with them, in the same way your API uptimes and other things are part of that agreement.
Right. Makes sense. Another question from LinkedIn user. How should data contracts not be used? I have a follow-up question after this. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Antipatterns.
Antipatterns. I think, like we said earlier, like they shouldn't be used as some kind of legal agreement by trying to block collaboration, trying to slow people down. Like data contracts do add work to data generators. They do add friction in places, intentionally in places like we spoke about. But it doesn't have to necessarily slow them down in the same way building APIs between teams doesn't slow them down too much. Like as long as you've got the right tooling, you can make that acceptable. You can make that fine. But you have to provide the right tooling, which it's not necessarily easy to do, but it's not even that hard either, I don't think. Don't use data contracts to try and build barriers, try and you just stick to hit people with, like use them for collaboration, accept the friction in places and agree that is why that friction is there. Like be clear on why that friction is there and make sure that is agreed by everyone.
How do you pitch this though? Because if you're a data person coming to me, say I'm the software engineer, and you're saying, "Oh, let's put a contract in place," I could see this discussion going a few ways. Either it goes really well, or I feel like, now you're putting up a bit more work for me potentially. And so maybe what are some suggested ways you pitch a data contract to the upstream producers?
Yes, I think it's all about the value you want to get from data. Like most organizations or businesses these days will have data as part of their strategy, as part of their, or needs data to meet some sort of a goal. So if you're a team working on using data to achieve some sort of business goal or some other business value, and you need better quality data upstream, go to that team upstream and say, hey, I need better quality data. I need data that looks like this, or you're currently missing data that I need, or whatever it might be. Just go have a conversation and say, this is why I need it. This is what I want to do for business. And like, it does sound like it's going to be hard to have this conversation. And I thought it would be at Coca-Cola as well when I started talking about data contracts, taking it to engineering teams who are busy, got plenty to do as well. But once I understood the problems we're trying to solve, and speak to them with the right language and Azure API helps, they were very receptive. They were like, yeah, I can see why that is not great. I can see why that's not very reliable. I can see why you're not very confident building on this. I can do it with work here to make it a bit easier for you. And then you get a question about prioritization and stuff like that. But that's really, you have to link it to your business goals, I think, and the business value, and that's where it all comes from.
Business value. Matt, you triggered?
Yeah. The vague but actually very powerful term too. Yeah. And I think this should be part of a larger discussion, Andrew and Joe as well. I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on this. But that is just in increasing collaboration between software teams and data teams. When I say software teams, in this case, I mean the application teams that are the data source. Because you were also saying, Andrew, that in addition to having data contracts, you have this pattern of multiple writes to different targets where you're writing to the application database, but you're also writing to your analytic systems separately, which I really like. It makes analytics more of a first-class citizen, but it's also more work for the application teams. So you really have to have a strong relationship between those teams to make that possible. One of the comments on here by a LinkedIn user said, culture beats strategy, right? And I think that's exactly the case here. But we really have to sell that kind of cultural change to make it happen.
Well, and as I also said, sometimes we put the cold in culture. So, depends where you work.
Yeah, I think when we talk about going to the product teams, engineering teams about this, they understand it very well. They are data consumers too in a lot of cases. So every service takes data as input, does something, more data as output, basically. That something could be done in Ruby or Java or DBT or SQL. It could be done in any sort of way you like, really. But many engineering teams depend on data from other teams, and normally the same data that the BI teams do and data scientists do, the kind of core data that describes your business, orders, or in our case, more movement of money and bank transfers and things like that. Whether you're an engineering team needing that data to go and implement a billing platform or something, or whether you're a BI team looking at joint revenue numbers, or a data science team looking to try and identify fraudulent payments, it's all the same data and you all have the same requirements. You need them to be reliable. You need some stability in that data if you can build it with any confidence. So I don't know why we've always thought data consumers, with traditional data consumers, BI and data science, why they are much different to other engineering teams, also data consumers.
And so it's almost like this should be considered a continuum where maybe data contracts aren't that different from other types of contracts and from APIs themselves. Like it's just a different version of an API maybe.
Yeah, and we've actually seen data contracts are used quite a lot at Coca-Cola, just between engineering teams, just for service communication. So around, I think over 8% now of our in-service communication, asynchronous in-service communication is all via data contracts. And some of those don't go to BI at all, don't go to BigQuery at all, just via PubSub. So it's useful for them too. And I think that's partly because at Coca-Cola at that moment, we are in a move from a monolith architecture to a more service-orientated microservice architecture. So we're starting to have more service communication, and when data contracts came at the right time to support that as well. And that's probably helped us with the overall messaging of data contracts, for the data teams as well as for other engineering teams.
I mean, for software engineering though, right? Though it's like the notion of a software interface. And when I'm talking maybe a Java interface, for example, literally programmatically a Java interface has always been the implementation detail and the agreement that you're going to have, right? So so I think to your point, it's like these. It kind of harkens back to I just think the reality that everything in data, if you want to look at where data needs to go, look at what software's been doing for the past few decades. It seems like data's inevitably will catch up in some way, shape, or form. But again, as you point out, it feels like the old days. I think data was really about reporting and kind of the classic IT function of data. But the world's moved beyond that. It moved beyond that a long time ago, and so it makes sense to adopt a lot of the standard practices from software that have been tried and true and have been shown to work for decades now, right? So it's part of the maturity. That's all it is.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. And I think like you see that in architecture design over the last sort of 20 years, like we started off with porting with finite database sizes and big Oracle database on-prem or something. It had to be quite constrained. You could only put in what you needed for the key KPIs. You couldn't do much else with it. It's too expensive. So you had a natural bottleneck there. And then although we no longer have that constraint in technology, we've got cloud, we've got relatively cheap storage. We've always put bottlenecks somewhere. Like bottleneck has always been somewhere in the architecture, whether it's kind of like Hadoop and HDFS, and you've got people writing Spark jobs, but only finite people can do that. It's very hard, very expensive. So the actual data you can use is the small bit coming out the end of those Spark jobs. So another bottleneck there. And then now we can use like just SQL and DBT and stuff, but we've still got a bottleneck in terms of like there's only so many people can write those DBT jobs. The actual usable data is they coming after those DBT jobs, not before. So we keep putting bottlenecks in preventing limiting the amount of accessible and usable data in business. And those bottlenecks be data professionals, data engineers particularly. With data contracts and to a certain extent data mesh and data products and things like that. By moving that left, we can have more accessible, better quality data produced by more people, not just from data engineers. And from then on, they can be used by BI people, by data scientists, by other engineering teams, by whoever it needs to be used by to achieve the business goals.
Well, and rewinding just a bit, Andrew, about the asynchronous messaging pattern. Let me make sure I understand this. So in other words, the pattern here is that rather than doing a pull pattern where I make an API call, grab some data, pull it back, it's a push pattern. So applications are pushing data onto PubSub queues, PubSub topics, and then other parts of the other services are pulling messages off of that bus and reading them. And so it almost sounds like you have in your organization, you have a situation where maybe analytics is coming back and influencing your software development patterns. And to Joe's point, like none of this is necessarily brand new, but like maybe that's a more favored architecture because you are thinking in terms of messages and analytics rather than just thinking in terms of pulls from APIs. Am I getting that right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, exactly that. So yeah, these kind of patterns going hand in hand, like what we've been doing in the data world with things like Kafka and PubSub and event-driven streams and sort of batch publishing and things like that. Yeah, that's kind of come back to influence how we're doing a lot of our just moving data around really, because that's what we're doing really, just moving data around between services, whether that service is a data science model or whether that's a Looker dashboard or whether that's another engineering service. It's all the same really. At architecture level, we don't really care.
They don't really care. That's absolutely right. Yeah, that's pretty cool. So, I mean, if you kind of zoom out, maybe if you're to become Nostradamus for data contracts, what do you think happens in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we'll continue to see more people adopting it or something similar to it in their organizations. Hopefully writing about it, and showing it like PayPal did, and we can continue to evolve on how we're doing that. So I think it's still quite early days, really. We're still kind of learning quite a lot.
Feels like it's early days, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you an example though, right? So last week I was flying to Vegas, and coincidentally sitting right next to me was data engineers from a very big company. I'm not going to say who, but they were doing revamping their architecture and implementing data contracts. That was a key part of the new architecture they're working on. So I think to your point, it's like this is a very big company. You would know them if you heard them. And that was one of the key things. So, whereas a few years ago, right, in architecture with data contracts, I don't think we would have been talking about that. That wouldn't have been a discussion point.
Mhm.
So it just kind of shows how the idea's grown, evolved. So
Yeah, I think the reason why it's a big idea now is because people, like you said a minute ago, like we are not just doing like reporting of data anymore. Like data is integral to every part of the organization of business. It's for most organizations, or for many at least, like data is really the key differentiator you've got. It's what makes your business defensible. It's what someone else can't copy your data. They can build your applications. They can re-implement those in different ways, sell them cheap or whatever. But if you've got good data, you can then build products on top of that data that no one else can build, at least not as quickly, not as easily. So data is becoming another more important part of every business strategy. And to do that well and to do that effectively and relatively cheaply, because I think we've been doing it quite expensively over the last few years, but these days that's not acceptable either. You have to start just being a bit more disciplined about the way you're producing and using data. And that starts from the source, from generation.
well, cool. I know it's been a fun chat. I know that before we talk, Matt and I have to actually get going in a second. So
this is great.
Cut it short. Yeah, but fantastic. I think we could keep going on about the nuance of data contracts for a while. But to the audience, great questions. Great discussion. So your book, right, coming out next week. So people can pre-order it on Amazon and anywhere else. Who's it with? What's the publisher?
Publisher is Pact. It'll be on like every kind of book place you can expect to, like your early subscription and people like that as well, places like that as well. And yeah, it's coming out next week. A lot of it is about this cultural change and collaboration as well. It's not just about the tech, although there's a good chapter, I think it's a good chapter on the some implementation I mentioned earlier. But yeah, even if you're not looking at implementing it yourself, but looking more strategically and culturally about your data, there hopefully should be something there for you too as well.
Yeah, congrats on finishing a book. That's really fun. So much fun. So,
Thanks.
Well, it's good when it's done, but
yeah, you're going to feel such a sense of relief, especially with all the stuff going on in your family. And I'm sure you're just underwater.
Yeah, it's fun, but it wasn't easy, as you know. But yeah, I'm very proud of it, and I hope some people enjoy it. And if I do, I'd love to hear from them.
Well, I mean, it also, I think, speaks to the maturity or the growing maturity of data contracts. There's a book about it now. Again, a few years ago, you wouldn't have seen a book on this. I think most publishers would be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And can you write a book on TensorFlow or something? So, but here we are today. And by the way, there's some good questions in the chat here if you want to go through and maybe answer them individually. I know we have to cut out early. Again, it's July 4th weekend or week, whatever you want to call it. Every day Saturday, I guess, somewhere. Yeah, Matt and I have to cut out. So yeah, thanks for being on the show, man. Good chat. Next week we have Andreas Welch. He's the VP of AI over at SAP. Any other announcements, Matt or Andrew, you guys want to give a shout out to?
I think that's it for now, Andrew.
You're on Chris Tabb's show in a bit, right, Matt?
Yeah, that's true. I'll be on there just after this, which is part of the reason I have to jump off.
Back to back, yeah.
You
know how it is. Andrew, you got any other announcements about your book?
No, that's it. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Cool. And oh, by the way, so on Thursday, got an episode on the Joe Rees show with Tristan Handy, CEO of DBT. That's dropping, so that's gonna be a good chat. I think it's one of my favorite podcasts recorded so far. We talk about data, we talk about home remodeling, and kind of everything in between. So it's a good chat. So anyway, thanks, Andrew, and we'll see everyone next week. Take care.
Cool. Thanks.